Hi, I'm Angie, and I'll be covering Article 12, The Return of the Repressed, Psychology's Problematic Relations with Psychoanalysis by Gail Hornstein. So this article is about the disputes between psychoanalysis and psychology and how they were ultimately resolved. Psychology and psychoanalysis always try to remain in their own separate spheres, but always ended up being pitted against each other. So this fight first started happening in the 1890s when psychologists were attempting to create psychology labs at every university that allowed them to. And at the same time, psychoanalysts attempted to uproot psychology, and they captured the public's eye. So the biggest dispute between them was on how to define science. Psychoanalysts had nothing to do with methods and experiments, but rather if something was true. So it was all hypothetical. And psychologists try to replicate some of the ideas of the hard sciences like biology with their methods to make psychology more reputable. So psychologists dislike the idea of being subjective. And Knight Dunlap said psychoanalysts attempts to creep in wearing the uniform of science and to strangle it from the inside. So by the 1940s, psychoanalysis was becoming increasingly popular, and journalists didn't understand the difference between psychology and psychoanalysts. So the psychologists were upset, of course, seeing that psychology was being portrayed as a branch of psychoanalytic theory instead of its own subject. And by the mid-1940s, psychologists figured out a solution to the issue. They would stage carefully controlled experiments in regards to psychoanalytic theory, thus allowing them to prevent analysts from substituting the science with a subjective standard. So this led to so much analytic research that it was overwhelming. People were drowning in it. It did create jobs in meta-analysis, and Robert Sears was one of the first to be commissioned by the Social Science Research Committee. And this research became obsolete eventually because there was so much being created at the time. And all of it was the same. Some of them were very pro and others very anti-psychoanalytics. And it just didn't really matter anymore. And co-opting became used very often, masking psychoanalytic theory as psychology. This began in the 1920s with Watson. He relabeled things like unconscious to unverbalized and emotions to habits. And he never doubted Freud's findings, but he put them in his own terms. And Skinner did the same, but put them in operant terms, but he took Freud even more seriously than Skinner did. And the presence of Freud wasn't blatantly obvious, but because of his presence, it was an issue and it threatened the balance that psychologists created and forced them to redefine psychology in positive terms. However, with them always being at war, it was for the better. Psychology became more flexible, resilient, and experienced exponential growth because of the wars that was waged with psychoanalytics. And World War II also helped with legitimizing psychology as it began to treat soldiers who came home with PTSD. It wasn't called PTSD, but they began to treat them. And that is it.